Episode 186. The tables were turned. Jake heard sounds of wind and water on the other end. He asked, "Serena?" No reply. He checked his phone and it was the right number. However, why didn't she speak? "Where are you?" he asked, but still no one answered. The call was disconnected. In a fret, he started to call back, but then he got a message. It was a photo taken at the side of Colorado River. When the download completed, Jake saw that a woman was lying down on the bridge. Recognizing her outfit, he realized it was none other than Serena herself. Jake's pupils shrank, while Jackson took a deep breath. Before he said anything, his phone rang again. It was the same number from which the text message was sent, a local number. When he answered, he heard a hysterical voice. "Jake!" She sounded crazy. The familiar loud voice was terrible as ever. "It's you!" Jake narrowed his eyes, recognizing the wretched voice. Mrs. Cox laughed. "Are you surprised to see that I have your wife?" Jake's jawline tightened. His face got even colder. "What do you want?" He sounded calm, but his voice still fluctuated a little. Noticing that, Mrs. Cox laughed even more contently, listening to his panic. "You know very well what I want. I have been asking you for my daughter since so long. Gave you enough time to pay heed to my request, but you did not return her to me. So of course, I had to invite your wife over to educate her about the urgency of the situation." Jake gritted his teeth and gestured to Jackson. The years of friendship between them had made Jackson immediately understand to arrange people to launch a search along Colorado River. "I have sent your daughter to the hospital, Austin's first hospital. Where are you? I will send someone to take you there to see her." "Ha! You think I would believe you? You sneaky scum of a man. I will not fall into your trap again. You know, you're quite something. Even Michael fell for your tricks. You must be smirking at that then. How about now? Come and take your wife home. Come alone, and I'll give you something else along with her." Jackson stared his eyes wide and shook his head at Jake, mouthing, "Don't go." Ignoring him, as if he had seen nothing, Jake blurted out, "Okay, where are you?" Mrs. Cox quickly told him an address and said, "Come here alone. Do not call the police. I have a lot of men over here. If you call the police, I cannot guarantee what would happen to her." "Okay, give me 20 minutes. The location she gave him was a remote area, and it would take at least 30 minutes to get there. Mrs. Cox laughed wickedly. "You wish. I'm giving you 15. If you're any slower, I will ask my men to take care of her quite well." Listening to this, Jake's anger exploded like a volcano. However, he had to take a deep breath and say, "Okay, I'll be there." "Don't come! They have guns!" screeched a female voice. It was Serena. "Ah!" Jake's heart was in his throat. His calm look suddenly collapsed with her scream. "Don't touch her!" He lost control and roared, startling Jackson, who was standing beside him, equally perplexed. Jake's eyes were bloodshot. As the call was disconnected, he suddenly did not know what to do. Jackson was too surprised, as in so many years, he had never seen him like that. Quickly, Jackson grabbed his arm and shouted, "Jake, calm down. You have to think straight." Jake's hands were trembling slightly. Although he did not notice it himself, Jackson saw it. Holding his hands down, Jackson, much calmer than his friend, said, "Look at me." Squeezing his friend's hand hard, as if it was the only support he had, Jake looked up and said,
"Jackson, I have to go. Don't tell my grandpa or anyone else about this. I will be back soon. I will be back with my wife."
Then he quickly ran towards the elevator. His mind was completely blank. All he could think about was the time he had in hand. 15 minutes. Serena cried out loud out of nowhere, which startled everyone around her. The men who were watching her came up and covered her mouth. Mrs. Cox hung up the phone and kicked her down, cursing, "You little wench! Shut up!" Serena shrank back and struggled. However, both her hands and legs were tied. No matter how hard she tried, she could not move. "Be good, and I will do nothing to you. As long as your man gives me my daughter back, I will try to not let these men near you. How about that?" Serena's heart sank. She quickly shook her head and cried, "No, no!" "Nothing is impossible." Mrs. Cox used a black gun to tap her face and smiled. "Now are you frightened? Beg me to save your pretty little life. What a change you showing like the other day, when you were being so arrogant at the house. Beg me, and I might let go of you." Serena's tears fell. She huddled up and bit her bottom lip, staring at Mrs. Cox. Mrs. Cox sneered. "Stubborn, aren't you?" Then she asked the guy next to her, "Is Monkey here yet?"
"He's on the way."
Smirking at Serena, Mrs. Cox raised the gun and wiped it clean, looking relaxed. "Have you heard of HIV?" Serena's pupils shrank. She was terrified. "AIDS? I'm only telling you this so you know what I have in mind." Mrs. Cox lifted the gun and slowly loaded it. Pointing the gun at Serena, she suddenly shoved it at her and mouthed, "Boom!" Ah! Serena looked away and burst into tears, her body shaking in terror. Mrs. Cox and her men laughed together. For the first time, Mrs. Cox had felt powerful in this situation. She wasn't going to let Serena off so easily. Serena gritted her teeth to stop herself from making a sound. Her body shuddering, she gazed at them with her dark eyes. Mrs. Cox utterly enjoyed her look. She stood up and kicked at her. "What are you looking at?" Serena became silent and curled herself into a ball. "Where's your voice?" Mrs. Cox kicked her waist hard with her heels. She didn't stop till Serena whimpered. Taking a dozen hits, Serena gritted her teeth and remained silent. Not getting any response, Mrs. Cox felt a bit bored. She stopped and said, "Hey, why is Monkey still not here? It's been 3 minutes. I gave Jake 15 minutes. If he arrives and doesn't see her with someone, he will think that I'm too nice." What do they want? Serena clenched her legs and curled herself into a ball. Mrs. Cox saw that and sneered. "That's useless." A short, skinny man drove a motorcycle and approached them. Serena felt frustrated and desperate. This man must be the monkey that the old woman talked about. They were next to a highway, which was the route out of the city. Only cars going out would pass by. Her only hope would be for someone to rescue her before they made their move. But it was so cold and dark. Who would hear her? And even if they did, who would show up? It was next to impossible. The man on the motorcycle got off and walked towards Mrs. Cox. By their body language, it seemed these two knew each other for a long time. He smiled at her and said, "I take it you're back in the business, boss? It had been years since we had some professional players in the market. I feel like now the real fun will begin." What game were they talking about? A bunch of hooligans. talking about a business which was not up and running. She knew of Mrs. Cox's past stories, but never did she think there was a shred of honesty in them. Mrs. Cox had been a thief in the old days. She had even been locked up for stealing for years when she was in her late teens. But somehow, she had ended up with Michael Cox, who had married her, and she suddenly became a lady. Seeing another side of Mrs. Cox, Serena recognized that old habits die hard. She was the same old thief on the side. She felt disgusted looking at Mrs. Cox. Hearing Monkey's words, Mrs. Cox sneered. "Haven't you read the news? My husband is going bankrupt. My daughter's missing. You think there was any other reason for me to resort to my old life? Why else would I come back to the gang?" Hearing that, Monkey was surprised and asked, Your daughter. Isn't your daughter quite famous? Look at this." He showed her his phone. "It says your daughter failed to seduce Jake and was knocked up by this white guy. The whole thing went viral online within just an hour. Look at this. More than 500,000 likes and 200,000 comments." Mrs. Cox's face became pale as she watched the video. This was the video that was hacked by Stephen Wrong in Carson Robinson's study. Why was it still around? Why was it put on the internet? "Look, the latest news. Your daughter is giving birth. She had a hemorrhage and C-section. Hey, what are you doing? That's my phone." Mrs. Cox took the phone up and smashed it onto Serena's face. Serena's face went numb, and the light of the screen made her eyes prickle. She looked down and saw the text on the screen. DNA test after C-section. No biological relationship with the Robinson family. Monkey walked over and picked his phone up. When he saw Serena's face, his eyes lit up. "And who may be this tormented pretty little thing? Quite the looker she is." Mrs. Cox smiled scornfully and kicked Monkey in the knees. He immediately fell towards Serena. "Pretty my ass! How can she be compared to my daughter?" Monkey didn't pay heed to what Mrs. Cox said. He kept looking at Serena with lustful eyes. "Well, it's your lucky day. I heard you became sick after the last woman you slept with. Why do you keep the disease with just you? Keep this one for yourself, then. Spread the joy. What do I care?"